Hello everyone, today we talk about the awakening of the Mongols and of Genghiz Khan. Considering that we haven't talked much about Mongol history, and this is just maybe still part of a broader introduction, but we'll try to observe certain dynamics of the phenomenon, explain a bit, also the success of Genghiz Khan, and in general the scale of his achievements and its consequences, given that we will not talk about the further Mongol expansion after his death, at least in this video, because we will continue. It's a lot of stuff, right? And again, we still have to do a lot in general, and after that in detail. And in general, we have seen, let's say, how the Eurasian dimension counts in most of our historical, global perspective at the end of the day, because of all what brought essentially the Eurasian civilizations to have a major impact in the rest of the world. And we mostly concentrate in the West because this is kind of, in fact, a Western channel in perspective. But as you know, I've increasingly, or at least I've began to, let's say, to add something more about the East, and even properly a Chinese perspective, especially medieval warfare. We have began very, very few things, but still we will expand dramatically on that in over time, if we're gonna have time to get with the other things anyway, without taking space from the other things we do, importantly enough. And this is important because when we think many times, we've seen it in the history of knighthood, talking a lot about the migration era, and even Indo-European history and beyond. It's the religious military background. We have observed, in fact, the western side of the aisle, whereas the push of the nomadic populations of the Eurasian steppes happened both towards the west and towards the east, right, in comparable fashion. And it's easy here to see the thing, because longitudinally speaking, just the steppes are this stripe that runs literally across almost all the longitude of Eurasia, and that generated this amount of warlike populations that were driven by a dramatic moral force that, in a way or another, was able to not really to overrun the rest, right? The gray sedentary populations that fundamentally were in contact with the same steppe, but still to have a radical impact on their culture. So much that, independently from the demographic dynamics, the biological, continuity, etc., what we look at mostly is a culture that was never, able to detach itself from these origins, because the steppe is not technically an origin. The word of the steppe, also, as we have seen with that video about the genesis of cavalry, quite tactically meant, is a recent one, right? The steppes, the horse, are modern inventions, we could say, provocatorily. But it's really the lifestyle that accompanied these, and generally speaking, the previous, previously it was still already a sanitary reality, but the time of hunter-gatherers wasn't that far away, and so lots of this idea of mobility, of semi-nomadism at least, right, was associated with a kind of set of warlike values that, in a way, remain still to our days in a chivalric sense, right, drawn this constant reinjection of the steppe element in our more sanitary realities, that in fact informed our culture basically more than the beliefs that stood, say, it can be prevalent maybe in a moral sense in terms of, as we've seen recently, of this tonic dimension of fatalism and abandonment to pathos and to this passivity towards the world, right? But that in an ideal sense, where I actually draw dramatically from the Apollonian, Uranic religions that were brought by these conquerors. And so we're talking mostly about different phases also of waves from the steppes, right? The first ones were the Indo-Europeans. Eventually, in the early Middle Ages, the Turks prevailed. And in the High Middle Ages, between the 12th and 13th century, essentially was the Mongols that pushed forward. And naturally, these populations, by a certain degree, were mixed, but roughly the succession was this one. We've seen naturally different, sometimes there were other elements, even ungraphic ones. It depends on where and when we would look at things, and of course the ethnogenesis of these populations, at least of some of the tribes of the peoples, we identify as debatable in a way, but in general that's the scanning. And so these movements are constantly underrated in our culture, I believe, because we have wanted kind of erase the idea that there is still a primordial, violent, aggressive core to the nature of our civilization that constitutes at least a good third, and that does stem, right? Is basically civilization cannot exist without, and does stem prepotently from at least was championed evidently by these peoples, and also the ones that in fact we descend from, and that even in the moment of complete sedentarization, still maybe not even having a lot of cavalry or anything, but they still were fundamentally obsessed with this idea of dominating the world from the skies, from the heavenly horses, and being all intertwined with this celestial ideal. And talking about the Mongols, naturally, this aspect pertains mostly to the east, to Asia, right? In Europe, we can hardly see, if not maybe in Eastern Europe, some element in the Balkans, or even in the same parts of Central Europe, to tell it all. The Mongols had an important impact, right? We wouldn't know Tsarism the way it existed historically without, the Muscovy being essentially a Tatar creation, right, politically speaking. And there is, however, a few that we can trace of that in the westernmost dimension of chivalry and those values. But still, right, there were some elements in common. It's just like when the Crusaders in the Near East met with the Turks, with the Seljuks, and they realized, after all, between fanatic hatred and absolutely reciprocated fanatic hatred and violence and of unspeakable dimension, was also a great deal of admiration, of respect, and especially of recognition of some common traits, chiefly the chivalric ones, right? Also, Islam had a chivalry on its own. It was in part different from, these were kind of universal values. This is what I'm talking about, is that there is something all human in them, but that are much deeper than we usually recognize, and that were in fact present there, even in those cultures that we regard as the most democratic and republican, at least that we decided for some reason to depict in this way, like the Greeks and the Romans, that in actual fact were obsessed with these ideologies just basically as any other people out there that were fundamentally aristocratic and militaristic at the deeper core of their values. So speaking of the Mongols, sometimes, and that's something I addressed in a video made a couple of days ago, kind of introducing this topic relatively to European knowledge of Asia before the Mongol invasions. It's not easy to understand the magnitude of the Genghiz achievements for a Westerner, because we haven't properly lived within the wake of that tradition. We have also and eventually interacted with Asia, with the East broadly meant. in ways that simply made us see things in another way, and that we're still essentially parading our own chivalric pride, but mostly from a previous, mostly Indo-European dimension fundamentally. But a very few episodes in human history took the same meaning and significance and importance like the Mongol conquests in Asia. In all the cultures that were encompassed by that. It's something very late in time, and you can argue that there is something northern hyperboreal in the idea that the more primitive the people and the more this kind of archaic, let's say almost archetypal force, right, that is spent gradually in the history of civilization. The Mongols were the last of this, right, and it's quite important because we're talking about 700 years where none of this has happened anymore, or at least, where, even whether there were some powers that essentially took over the world, they wouldn't do it from the same standpoint, with the same ideology, with the same mechanisms that we see today. Migrations still exist, and there is something similar to this, like, there is a primitive force that still, exists in many populations around the world that, however, cannot really compete with the degree of, structured, civilizational achievements that derived, from essentially those primitive peoples developing in something way more consistent that today maybe, we see, especially in the West, as being in crisis, right? But it's a very common, at this point of globalization, very common situation, a very shared phenomenon. Right, and we can't talk about anymore about one people that will, resume this universalistic ideal of systematic subjugation and imperialism fundamentally. Not even, I know some of you are thinking about subjugation in terms of Islam, right? Or I don't believe that there is any of that, frankly. Nor the actual force for doing it, nor the not even in the social consequences that we see today, right, and the enormous presence, for example, of Muslims and also different generations in the West, properly as a demographic force. It's not the same dynamic. It's not comparable because there are much greater forces that intervene within our own worlds that we try, in fact, to mostly isolate in this mostly superficial one, if you say visibly superficial one, but the topic is too complex, and frankly, we cannot address it today. But it's important to stress that the Mongols were kind of this last people to be, like in the most savage and primitive of corner of the world, of the enough habitated world that kind of ended. There is also this west and east dimension, right? That properly of the steppe, whereas the western steppes kind of, you can argue, civilized earlier, right? And so they kind of also approach civilization earlier, and then you have, in fact, the Europeans and the Turks and the Mongols. So you go always east, right? And at some point you exhaust the peoples, right? This is something that happened in Europe too, in a certain sense, that we can't even see in the Romans towards the Mediterranean, and then the Germans, and then eventually maybe you can even see the northern world in the modern age as a bit of the revival. Think about the British, think about the Swedish Empire, and so on, of these last of the primitives, ideally, right? But having this spurts of power, but naturally it even at that point, especially in the modern age, it's something already very different. There is not an equivalent to, not even remotely close to what happened in the 13th century, nor the subsequent waves of Mongols, Tatar power, think about Timur Lenk and so on, can compare, right, with what happened with Genghiz Khan. So it's important because these forces molded the world as we know it, but these forces were capable still of literally creating other types of civilization, even though they contained some universal values, they still interfered with the sanitary ones in ways the outcome of which was somewhat unforeseen. And that is not even being completely solved in some ways. And of course, there was an enormous deal of ideological contamination, and so you can argue that also the Mongols, in this sense, owed their greatness to something very similar to the one that the Romans probably had owed. We made a video recently. This was the kind of an idea of moral superiority on a meritocratic sense, based on the actual actions and success, right? And Genghiz Khan was this kind of, if you want, not necessarily anti-conservative side of Mongol culture, at least within the various tribes that still seeing things as very inwardly oriented, and whereas Genghiz Khan fundamentally didn't just wipe out peoples, but fundamentally integrated almost at a familiar, or literally at a familiar level, also subjugated ones. And in this sense, understood the magnanimity of the system that surely was ruthless and extremely cold and violent, but still in this sense very rational, right? The Mongols, I don't believe there is still anyone believing that the Mongols were just a bunch of savages were exterminated just because of the taste of blood or all these things. Surely they were viciously violent in ways that quite hardly can be found comparatively in historical matters, but still, as most of these situations pre-industrial times, or at least in community systems that didn't have many options, where if you really read them from the field, you realize that they were crystal lucid choices aimed at very specific political and strategic goals that include deterrence and this capacity of in fact striking fear and maintaining this enormous system. In the case of the Mongols, also finished, right? This is yet another aspect that, in my opinion, does make the Mongol Empire competing, not even by a stretch of the imagination, let's say, the Roman one, for spite of the fact that, indeed, after Alexander the Great, also the legacy of which didn't live on like the Roman one, but Genghiz Khan is definitely the greatest other conqueror, and then definitely in the annals of military history after the Roman army, as a comprehensive system in general, right? It's not much of, even a matter of tactical scores, but the Mongol one is the only comparable, in fact, to the Roman achievements. And the question is how they did it, right? And how they came to do this. And so that's not an answer we can't give so straight away and without looking at things a bit more in depth. But we witnessed by the 12th century to a true and sudden, in this sense, awakening or reawakening by a certain degree of the Mongols that were essentially just nomad shepherds that inhabited today's eastern Mongolia, so basically southwest of Manchuria. The Arabs called them Tatar, from which the Latins derived the word Tartars, that, in fact, reminded of the pagan hell, the Tartarus. So the word game is quite eloquent, and surely the Mongols earned such a hellish reputation, especially from the side of those who had to cope with their own onslaught, and that's part of the deal, that, as we've seen, they were making things function like, and also still, of course, from a Western perspective, we know that we had to make sense of these peoples in a biblical function, so that we identified the Mongols with some other kind of monstrosities that would have emerged from this far east a land of savages and of a quite bizarre world that was perceived in the sense of a world of legions, of monstrosities, of things that, however, the Europeans, as we will see and we have already seen in part, were making sense kind of in a rational way. The Mongols were immediately spotted, let's say, scoped by the Westerners to try to cooperate with them to knock out Islam from one side, and things then went different directions. But the Pax Mongolica was a reality, not very far away from the West, and especially in areas that were visited frequently by the Westerners, and that allowed also during that period, during the 13th century, is definitely the peak of the great medieval civilization all over Eurasia. To actually visit China, so what had become actually that's a trait of the Mongol Empire, the fact that as a nomadic population they had fundamentally just eventually settled in areas that were more developed, and they ruled from there, so that they kind of, yes, they brought their own culture that importantly impacted the local one, but still they ruled from systems that were dramatically more developed than theirs, right? Which is a great difference, as we were saying before, with, for example, the Roman Empire and so on. And the obvious, this is obvious on the ground of course, of the fact that the Mongols retained their own nomadic lifestyle. They didn't transform into something else, right? Their ruling dynasties, many troops and colonists. So yes, they did settle in areas, but even demographically speaking, like systems like Persia or China, especially, and later on, also India through different paths, or even the Western Eurasian steppe kind of absorbed. Like it's just a bit like the Islamic invasions, right? The Arabs in Arabia remained Arabs, remained, at least especially in the areas from which Islam had properly spread, they remained Bedouins up to the 20th century, right? It's not that brought any fundamental change to that system. So when we look at the caliphates, we're looking at essentially, or the sultanates, the emirates, how they turned. Like we're seeing essentially some not Arab powers. We're seeing Arabicized Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Persian, Tunisian, Spanish powers, right? And so with Arabicized elites, and surely Arab culture at that point, in language, in writing, in many aspects that also the Arabs, in fact, at that point took from other cultures also of the past, and that had a very deep connection also with Far East Asia, compared to, especially to the Europeans, made the whole thing up. So the Mongols arguably were the same, right? And part of their success was owed exactly to, as many primitive peoples, to the actual lack of a cultural resistance, right? There is this, common mistake that is usually done in a civilizational perspective, for which we think that primitive peoples have some kind of of core resistance to civilization. No, that's mostly a contingential incapacity because of lack of moral and material capacities to transform into that. But as long as they are open to the possibility, they immediately absorb that, and they're often able also, of course, to create some new syncresis. But at the end of the day, they also kind of get diluted into the larger systems that are instead much more difficult to change culturally, and that's why sometimes they collapse even so easily in front of some more primitive peoples, because they lack the capacity of adaptation to a dramatically concentrated force. It maybe doesn't come from, in fact, dramatic cultural development, but is very focused on action, on violence, on this systematic conquest, even just of psychophysical fitness that in the making up, the eventually extending organizationally and politically to their own military systems, these other cultures cannot quite, stop in a way. So such big changes like the one brought by Genghiz Khan do not happen without, some prodromes, some premonitions almost. As von Clausewitz says, in quite abstractly in this context at least, war is never an isolated phenomenon, right? There is always something that has to bring to it, and definitely the steppes world at the time was again in agitation, right? As we've seen before, there had been the Turkic phase previously that had mostly agitated things and then somewhat settled. The steppes were definitely not a particularly stable, environment, politically speaking, by default. But greater dynamics were starting to put in motions. And part of the reason was, of course, that, as always, the great empires that dwelled at the steppes boundaries were starting to feel insecure. And this is mostly what happens historically. It's not that great empires fall because, there is much of an external force that out of the blue, arrives and makes them crumble. Most of the time it's because they have irreparably, complicated things within themselves, so that they're almost paralyzed, and people from the outside realize that, and they start to interfere with them and breaking them further. But the main force there is put in motion for destroying them is put by those empires themselves, not really about these peoples that otherwise wouldn't have much of a shot. And the proof being that the millenary existence of sedentary empires that with very specific civilizational characteristics, and these primitive peoples at the outskirts of them, that if they could have done it all the time, they would simply invade it and conquer. Instead, most of the time it had not been possible. And sometimes, however, there is especially both in the West and in the East, the frontier, the boundaries are very blurred, and sometimes for quite extended areas. For example, in today's southern Russia, at the time, a people of Turkic Mongol stock, the Kazaars, were settled. During the 8th century, before the Slavs of the principalities of Kiev and Novgorod converted to Christianity under the Byzantine influence, had chosen to pass en masse to Judaism. It's a quite interesting thing, right? They weren't only Jews. Fundamentally, they were just superficially so, because they were actually pagan. But this idea of the spread of monotheism in the steppes is something that was actually quite common among the Mongols themselves. There were lots of Christians and Buddhists. Well, Buddhism is not quite a monotheism as we intend, but let's say, these great religions, proper of the advanced stage of civilization, of the sanitary world, had spread through the steppes, right, in ways that, even up to half of a millennium ago were not really prohibited, but quite much more distant properly. So that's how fast ideas travel. That's how, let's say, how much we tend to underestimate how much these peoples were much more aware of the sedentary world than the sedentary world was aware of them, for the aforementioned reasons, because the sedentary world was fat and satisfied and kind of okay and didn't care about this primitives, whereas these primitives were hungry, and every single minimal factor could essentially kill them, and so they had to necessarily exploit anything that was happening in the sedentary world. And as you'll see also in Genghiz Khan's conquest, it was a dramatic intelligence system, a reconnaissance system that the Mongols put up to to properly investigate the world, to open to it and to take over it fundamentally. And this is a bit the fate of all civilization. Also because, again, even archaeologically, we know this, that, historically we know that the sanitary peoples didn't even quite understand what the steppe was, right, geographically or ethnographically. Whereas archaeologically, their relics were scattered all over the steppes, so it means that the steppes received that were surely more aware of their own ways, but still effective ways of the sedentary world for the aforementioned reasons. The Khazars had converted to Judaism in this sense. Some were already at the time, they weren't just Jews, they were also Christians, they were Muslims. It's fair to say that this was mostly an elite thing, because Judaism was kind of, in the club of okay religions for entertaining international relationship on a decent, legitimate level. With Constantinople, there were Khazar princesses married, to emperors and all these things, obviously converted to Christianity at that point. And so that was a way to enter, the upper class in a way. But the majority of these peoples were pagan, obviously pagans, also because their lifestyle was, didn't require the ideological development of a monotheistic religion, and nobody cared effectively that the majority remained pagan. But after their Pacific presence, let's say, there was another people that was akin to the Khazars, were the Pechenegs, the Patzinaks, that actually the Khazars were taken over by the Rus, right, gradually, so much that actually most of the Jews that we see historically scattered in Eastern Europe were mostly kind of not coming from the original. Right, this is all a problem in Judaism, because at least of the Orthodox current that stresses the biological continuity of the old or the original Jewish tribes, etc. And so the Khazars instead spread and settled in, contributing also to the also because the Khazars were in between the great, think about the Silk Roads, Eurasia here, so they knew their deal in that sense. They settled in Central Eastern Europe, settled by the local monarchs. At that point, were trying to build urban economies and with trade, and so something to counter the lack of cities in that region of Europe, and and also in this sense the omnipower of aristocracy, of rural aristocracy. So these elements were quite important, as you know, for developing cities like, I don't know, Prague, or the great, even in Poland. And the Khazars in this sense were substituted by yet another wave. This was kind of typical, right? That this, in this axis west and east, as long as one people was taken out, was another taking their place. Because it's, those that had managed to move west had become richer and softer. So they were initially the strongest because they had achieved that, but then they kind of declined along that pattern, and a stronger pressure arrived from the east and took their place. It was a very complicated mechanism. In this case, as we've seen, the Khazars were actually knocked out also by the Russians, but it was always the next one that would arrive, and the Pechenegs were quite of a problem. They kept the Russian princes quite busy, as well as the Byzantines, up until Constantinople in 1122 managed to defeat them. And also the impact of these peoples in Eastern Europe, even in the Balkans, etc., it's remarkable. Also in Central Europe, right, there are so many ethnonyms even connected to these populations, because not only they were just there, in a sense, at the boundary between the sedentary world and the steppes, but properly once they were defeated, were resettled, famously enough. This would occur also with the Mongols, right? The Russians called, before the Mongols arrived, was something totally new. They called these Turkic peoples that they settled in their own lands our own pagans, because they were kind of, the ones that had always been used to. I don't know, the Hungarians kept settling them, in part of their continuity of their steppes legacy, and always the objective was always countering the nobility. the same thing happened, I don't know, the Lithuanian Commonwealth up to the modern age, right, with the Tartars and so on. So that's kind of a constant presence, also because, frankly, these peoples were unstable enough to constantly harass the sanitary areas with raids, and as far as, I don't know, Serbia through the Danube Valley and so on. And so always taking some routes that still today, if you look at the political geography of Europe, you realize have left a mark in the, dimension of stages of development, of stability, political cohesion, because, being exposed to nomadic raiders for millennia fundamentally does change the communities that live there. We've seen it even militarily speaking. There are very interesting aspects, especially about the Slavic warfare, that were, connected to the to the secular clash against the nomads. And as we were saying before, these waves never ended, because after the Pechenegs there was yet another wave, that was the one of the Cumans or Polotskians, that were also basically, you would argue that yes, they had some ethnic recognition, maybe in the way they clothed or their hair, all the things, but essentially were always the same thing. There was these swarms of horse archers with a tiny but very strong heavy cavalry component that would, their main thing was laying waste everything they found in front of them. They were pervasive, like locusts almost. And so also the demonization of their lifestyle, their actions, and the fact that they were obviously pagans was, a way that, just like in the West, we formed the idea of them as kind of hellish creatures emerged, in fact, from the Tartars themselves. And as we've seen, that was the Arab loan, the way they call these people. In the meanwhile, in the full desert of Asia, south of the Balkhash Lake, there was another empire that, a nomadic one, let's say, that known as of the Qara-Khitai. He also made a video about their warfare, the Liao Empire, for example. And the Chinese rulers' song, in order to defend them from this new, political coalescence, because calling them empires is also problematic in a certain sense, because, an empire is normally, eventually what the Mongols did under Genghiz Khan, that is to say that there was a unified people with a kind of national identity, at least built around the way, that began to systematically subdue basically most of Eurasia. So that's kind of an empire, right? By kind of collapse at a certain point. Whereas these systems were mostly like some sort of confederacies, where, they were created through the concentration of power to mostly one tribe that kind of was the imminent, the hegemonic one, and so on, that kind of directed the thing, but it was very complicated. So the Chinese, at this point, were also, China was divided into dynasties, but let's say the north was also kind of, from many centuries, right, exposed to this nomadic influence that, that China had a kind of a similar history to the one of the Roman Empire in terms of these barbarians, let's say, at the gates. So there was something already Mongolic in China before, of course, the 13th century. And so, as it was habitual, the song called to their help other Turkic Mongolian populations, the Jurchen that were settled between Mongolia and Balai, that is Manchuria essentially. And however, these swarmed quite soon within the same northern China. So it's normal. It's a bit like it had happened in the 5th century Western Roman Empire, right? You were kind of, there was this constant pressure. These peoples were searching for new lands to settle, and you couldn't really stop them, but you could negotiate with them, kind of a settlement with a cooperation. participation to the universal empire in exchange for, some obedience and so on. But at a certain point, the system was also, incapable of controlling these peoples within your own territory. So they started creating kind of autonomous powers. However, the very vast territories between the Great Siberian Rivers and the Chinese Great Wall was populated by nomad tribes that, to their detriment, were in continuous war against each other, meaning that as long as they kept behaving like that, they were not particularly dangerous. And so that's what also the Mongol Awakening in there is something in the Liao Empire that is almost, path opening, right? But nothing to compare to what Genghiz Khan actually achieved. And so apparently, yes, there were these movements, but there was no force that would manage to catalyze a unitary, action that would be so overwhelming like the one eventually would happen. So the creation of a Khan, right, of a major leader capable of unifying them, didn't seem to be there. Kind of the Chinese, I presume, were kind of confident of that. So speaking of Genghiz Khan, that, as you know, was named actually Temujin, which means probably Smith or some kind of equivalent, that would have become, together with Alexander the Great, the greatest conqueror of all times. We know actually very few. And it's one of kind of those figures that are, of course, surrounded by legend, because, again, the East is not the West in terms of historical recording, and also properly what was happening in the steppes was even less to be known. It's like, does it even really matter what the Huns were, for example? Who cares, right? Yes, there is an historical relevance to it, but notoriously, kind of, we cannot know. And yes, we have some ideas about that, but, is it more important to see what actually happened rather than, listening to myths and narratives and so on? We know so few about Temujin. We know even the year of his birth that could even swing 12 years between 1155 and 1167. He was the son of a chieftain settled on the upper Onan river, east of essentially the Baikal Lake, and according to legend, he lived his childhood and his youth, fundamentally first youth at least, among these vicious clashes and vendettas that involved different tribes, right? There was a time where he was probably even captured as a slave, also others in which he had to live as a, in the wilderness, literally hunting animals to survive and things like these. And that's the level, he belonged to, kind of, you can argue that the nobility or the aristocracy, whatever you want to call it, but that's the stage of, primitiveness of such peoples, and what kind of, their cultural background, material world that they came from. A very primitive world. And Temujin's rise began when he entered the service of the Qara-Khitai, a Turkic Mongol tribe of Christian religion and of Nestorian confession. That Christianity had been a big thing in Asia and in China in the early Middle Ages and so on, so eventually to be recontained. But let's say the advantages that such religions provided, but not in a very different way from the process of what you can see in the process of evangelization of Europe for aristocracies to have kind of a greater legitimacy and even some form of administration. Well, okay, Mongolia, that was very different, but at least it's kind of understandable. But that tells you also how close, right, the world, how small the world was in a sense. If some of these Mongols could be Christians, and Christian powers, recognizably as such, were quite distant, and that tells you how intense such such ideological contacts and needs and instruments were for these peoples to serve themselves of them politically. And Temujin married the daughter of the Karaite chieftain, Börte, who was his first wife. The Mongol aristocracy had multiple wives, and mostly from the subjected populations, because the idea was, you conquer people. The Mongol formula was usually normal. You would exterminate the man, take the women, and enslave some of other elements, or maybe. So it was quite mixed in nature, because of course you may have at that point freed other tribes who were subjugated to that one and bring it to your side. I mean, but the contexts were quite difficult. Even this fact of having many wives was a way to evidently create a sense of identity that among the next generations that would compensate for that dramatic lack of any kind of statal or centralized capacity that these peoples could have. And from the marriage with Börte, Temujin obtained the basis to widen further his dominion, essentially crushing and assimilating the surrounding tribes. Even this was a quite troubled moment. Börte was kidnapped at some point, so by Temujin's enemies. He risked assassination, and the whole package you can imagine in this kind of Mongolian feuds. Let's say in 1206, however, the entire Gobi area was under Temujin's control. This was a clamorous achievement, because basically he managed to control basically the entire Mongolia, and that this was already something gigantic in accomplishment. In the great Qara-Khitai, that is basically a tribal diet, this assembly of the various tribes that was indicted at the springs of the Onund River. They were sacred. There were also the sanctuary, the mountain where Temujin would go to pray for Tengri. We'll see the religious moment in a while. That's probably where he was buried. Nobody knows where he was buried, because he had all the barriers killed, so nobody would know. And in fact, Genghiz Khan's grave is yet to be found, without a mark, because that's how traditionally Mongols were buried. He asked that even after he had created the empire further and so on. But on this occasion, however, on this council, Temujin was in fact named Great Khan, Supreme Khan. Of all the Mongols that had thus found a sort of kind of national unity, in the sense that at least if there was something that they felt to be akin, like similar language and traditions and so on, they felt at this point to be comprehensively under a single leader. And in fact, it's at this point that Temujin received the name we know him from, Genghiz Khan. So it means universal ruler. From hence also the Genghiz dynasty, so that more or less the descendants of Genghiz Khan, that as you understand were also many, that it wasn't quite the same way, say, criterion of dynastic succession as we intended now. Having just think that normally among the Mongols it was the youngest son that inherited, not the oldest. But aside from that, and still it was partitioned in different ways, and so, but think about all the children of Genghiz Khan, that were really many. And so many different rulers later on would claim direct descendancy from him, of course. which wasn't even that strange, as we've seen, considering this, the offspring. Naturally, we'll make other videos about Genghiz Khan in detail, and seeing how he first, directed towards the east. At this point, it began to penetrate China, fundamentally, then passed against the Khwarezmians. Empire destroyed it. Then, that's why they marched also into Russia to see what it was the situation like. Then he launched this other campaign against the Western Xia in China, and that's basically also when he died. So, also most of the the eventual Mongol invasions were carried out after him, and we consider them comprehensively as such, however, because this push kept also going on after his death. But today we talk about in general, in a sense, and so I think it's fair to say that Genghiz Khan was a conqueror and a organizer of peoples, right? The steppes had kind of always had this character, the idea that that there's a much better realization of the idea that you rule over peoples, right? Which has always been the case. It's the same right now, right? But aside from our modernistic understanding of considering mostly the territorial boundary as the criterion, where we don't understand that politics is about the people who live in them, and that boundaries change because of this. In the steppes, peoples were, as we have seen, much more difficult to control, and therefore they owned also kind of a greater, value in the form of properly their moral identity, which is what perhaps it's a bit more difficult for us, even through an imperial mindset, as we developed in the West, to realize at the root of it, what could mean, especially for a steppe people. The idea of guiding other peoples. And Genghiz Khan, with his properly meritocratic system that was unhinging the older Mongol traditionalism, was kind of co-opting the leaders of the defeated peoples. That, again, it was not a novelty. Other peoples had always done it, let's say, but now seemed to come to be a kind of a standard, so that his domination could become ever larger. And it's a great part of the mean through which he carried this out, and we can naturally speculate on the fact that a great part of the Mongol aristocracy was not entirely, probably, at least from a cultural point of view, was properly happy with this. And we can think of the same struggles within the Mongol world at that point that we could have seen through, in the Roman Empire, where with the patrician conservatives would try not to extend the citizenship, whereas the emperors would try, through the support of the people, to do it. Kind of a similar system. That here, however, was kept up by the fact that the Mongols were still warlike peoples in an absolute sense, meaning that they were only warriors, like there wasn't anything else practically in a nomadic pastoral society. And Genghiz Khan, however, was an enlightened ruler, as of course he understood that after the first conquests in the more sanitary civilized world, and for the sake of the control of the same from the side of the Mongols, he had to introduce some kind of institutional reforms that also included, for example, language. He picked the Uyghur one, right, and standardized, let's say, for Mongol administration. There was among these cultures was kind of something between an oral tradition, but also, something that could be adapted according to the circumstances. So that Genghiz Khan's legislation, let's say, if we can call it like this, was mostly based on the capacities, of course, of the Mongols to keep their peoples under their own control, but so was relatively, relatively enforced in a sense. But it started from the traditions and of necessities of the Mongol people, that were essentially shepherds of horses, camels, and goats. So that there is a contrast between how the Mongols coped, let's say, with the other nomadic populations, kind of guiding them, literally, sometimes resettling them, because they were quite flexible in that matter. Even just being open to a conquest in a sanitary area meant, in a sense, for these peoples to finally find that what they had always dreamt of, right? That is settling in a fertile land where they wouldn't have to strive anymore, right? They would maintain their pastoral lifestyle for a while, but then they would also kind of change in nature in a way. And so there was all a different role there that was created. There were tribes also, I presume, probably of different function, right? As you can find certain tribal realities today. Some tribes were kind of more economically oriented, others more military oriented. Whereas ruling, more developed countries like China or others was yet another thing. It was kind of required, in fact, a great support of the same local cultures. And the Mongol system was largely based, especially in Genghiz Khan's time, probably, and would remain importantly so, but a lot of degrees later for centuries, on a great mobility of the tribes, right? But continuously in search of pastures, right? At some point expanding, at some point withdrawing on the same. It's a bit also how they had always been harassing each other, right? Most of Mongol warfare consisted in a permanent state, actually warfare in general, politically, but mostly with raids on cattle and so on, and chattel, and so on. And kind of eventually going for it more directly at some point, but still being always used to a kind of a militarized lifestyle. So unavoidably, also think it in a global perspective. Here we're talking about huge distances, thousands of kilometers, thousands and thousands of kilometers, that you have to to which you can have to add the difficulties in communication of medieval times. The Mongols weren't scared. They had bred very specific horse races for supporting this quite stressful marches in terrifying climates, from the iciest to the most torrid and desertic, and that allowed them also a greater strategic mobility than other peoples. Not we shouldn't exaggerate that, but everything was functionalized, at least in that mobility capacity that would mostly make the Mongols, rather than speedier, but say capable of being on the move all the time, which is a big deal. And so Genghiz Khan's empire had a mobile political military organization, right? So imagine again on these huge distances the fact that you kind of Mongolia is in the north, so the globe kind of restricts there, right? And so you have towards the equator, basically you have these peoples had to descend on the various lands that they had further south, and so there was kind of like coming back to Mongolia also for the great political assemblies and deciding the next targets and so on. It was always departing from this great north and descending in these various surrounding areas from that central position that logistically was quite convenient. And a great part, naturally, of Mongol success in this regard was the increased hierarchization of the system, right? These Mongols began to one could ask, was there any specific what was the secret of Mongols' military effectiveness, right? We'll talk about that later. Well, it was mostly a tactical thing. Did they find a formula that would defeat the enemy on the field? This has nothing to do with that. We know as Clausewitzians more or less systems balance each other out, especially in real war when you have to go with enemies that still put you in front of of the evidence of a constant asymmetry in any single context. But this is about a system that was kind of fixing itself along the way. That is, the more experienced the army was, and the better they knew what they had to do, and the more you repeated that successfully, the more confident they would become, the more fluid the system would be, right? And so also the best elements would emerge in terms of leadership, right, and capacity emerge. And most of this was naturally done autonomously because the tribes were kind of autonomous in their own pastures, in their own lands. So the Khan called, and you just went there. And then, of course, the riches augmented. These people brought mostly also slaves back home. That worked for them. So there was a further, reinforcement of properly the moral material capacities of the army. And Mongol logistics and in fact strategic projection capacities were astonishing, right? The campaigns all across the around the Caspian Sea, crushing enemy after enemy, were something clamorous that resonated also in Europe, like even before the actual invasion of Europe, that were shocking the world, right? Even though we don't know objectively that much about them, and they're still kind of confused, in a almost mythical perspective, but we still know that they made it. So even if you just consider the distance from when they were departing, you understand that their system was something astonishingly effective, and this was a political success before any kind of military secret, right? It was about leadership, and in this sense, authority, order, discipline, collective, political cohesion, this coordination, as we've seen. Genghiz Khan had fueled by promoting those who would had to earn more from such participation. So also a bit the outcasts, those that had been defeated, wanted to ransom themselves in a moral, from a moral perspective, and acquiring greater, prestige in the eyes of this great father that the universal Lord embodied in fact, let's stress it, in a religious sense. And in fact, this is important about the Mongol hierarchy, and that the tribes remained independent, namely among one another, but this older, fanatic tribal idea of freedom, that, however, was mostly something else in a reality, as we've seen also in Europe. Like, there was always an aristocracy ruling over the free, let's call it this way. And then, like, most of this freedom was supported by the fact that nobody up to that point had ever had the strength to subdue each other, which they would have gladly done had they had the capabilities. Well, as we have seen, Genghiz Khan succeeded in a way that kind of compromised between the two things, and so also the expansion was a way to maintain that glue between, within the people. However, we've seen this also in the Kitao, in the Liao Empire's military organization, was kind of Mongol fundamentally in nature, that there was an important, let's say, dimension attributed to the divinity of the imperial family. But we call it imperial. Of course, they had other terms, but the idea of the oceanic ruler that rules, in fact, the entire world. And there is the old celestial idea of the greatest divinity of the Mongol people was Tengri, so the sky, and so with all the military lordship characters attached. For the rest, the 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 Mongols were fundamentally animistic, so they didn't even have a something like a clearly defined pantheon of gods, where everybody was mostly still connected to the various, I don't know, some mountains, springs, sanctuaries of various sort. They had local deities and so on. But the idea was still that there was a connection between the celestial overlord and the imperial family, so much that the center of the empire was embodied by the house, in fact, of the, so as it was called, the golden stock, so that the imperial family, the Genghizes, eventually were considered sacred, because in this sense they were essentially directly children of the greatest divinity, of Tengris. And so this naturally betrays a lot of Chinese influences at the same time, the divinity of the ruling dynasty, all these things, and were quite affirmed in the Mongol system. That was, in a way, we're not much habituated to this, because in the West we've mostly seen, when we talk about tribes, we talk about mostly our sanitary tribes, right? The ones of Central Northern Europe that were somewhat, tiny systems. They didn't have much of a, I don't know, for example, of a cavalry element. They didn't, even demographically, they were not as extended, let's say. They wouldn't rule on such a large scale like a Mongol system. It was all based on cavalry. It required therefore an enormous amount of lands and spaces, and that at that point was in contact with a dramatically much more divinely autocratic system like China than anything we had ever seen in Europe, right? Even at the apex of the Roman Empire. So in terms of scale, rate of reach. So the Mongol system, if you want, was much more brutally, kind of gigantic in scale, relatively to its power say extensional possibilities, and it was much more sympathetic to the idea of a, or at least much more compatible, or at that point, especially with the rise of Genghiz Khan, right, sympathetic to the idea of this strong kind of imperial, dynastic, divine character of the ruling house, which in our tribes we never found, was quite timidly, presented in a sense. So, and the single Mongol tribes in turn were structured in the same ways, meaning that the nucleus of the empire remained the ulus, that is to say, the entire unit constituted by a tribe and its assets, right? And this, with the Mongol Empire proper, this concept was transferred to the sum of the conquered lands that became the ulus of the imperial family, ideally, because also these were lands scattered everywhere, like from China to Persia and so on. And as you know, these places would, the Genghizes ruled dynastically. They had these various inheritances, but eventually, the empire lost its cohesion. There was no real political connection, between China and Persia for that matter. So this is interesting because it shows also how much the Mongols were prone to, how much retribution, let's say a reward, or at least how powerful the central dynasties was in terms for seizing, for essentially seizing as a personal asset all of these external conquests outside of of Mongolia itself, right? To be properly ruled and owned as a private possession of the imperial family. And these single clans kept having a great autonomy, but in this sense were confined just to Mongolia, in a way, right? They participated to the various conquests, but still within, in fact, the imperial ones, the ones of the ruling house, and they were all owed to be faithful and respectful towards the Great Khan, that in fact surveilled his lands through a very well rapid and organized system of intendants, superintendents, and runners, and so the messengers that would refer literally everything to the Great Khan. And this is a concept that recurs in the chronicles that say that, of course, ideally you could, I don't know what was the thing of the Virgin loaded in gold, could cross the whole empire without being touched by anybody. This is a bit, with those same narratives used even in totalitarian regimes. But in this sense, don't think that there wasn't an actual risk that literally the terroristic means through which this empire was kept together would make everybody being extremely cautious about whatever could happen to them, because great part of the Mongol policy there was recognizing that if they had not threatened of extermination anybody would even dare to think to oppose to them, they would have had much more problems to keep that effectively together. And that's in fact what happened at the beginning. There were some atrocious stories about the epochal massacres and destructions that the Mongol Empire carried out. More of that later. But the religious aspect is very interesting. As we were saying before, the Mongols were first of all animists and shamanists, right? They found, however, their, as we've seen, their recollection, a sort of cosmic monotheism that would have, so the great sky and then whatever was under it. So, as we were saying before, they didn't have like a structured politism or anything, so they were disposed to accept anything. Like, this is typical of paganism. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and they would. And not just because of, depending on where they settled, but literally, as we've seen, they had imported already in their lands. Genghiz Khan was personally very interested to the cosmic Chinese, say, religion philosophy of Taoism. Also because, according to legend, at least, he intended to strip to get from the Taoist wise men a secret formula of immortality. These were the mental horizons of a Mongol great Khan, which he believed, in fact, they were endowed. And exactly the religious aspect is one of the most fascinating of Genghiz Khan's personality, because he was the model of all the Mongol chieftains, right? So everything he did had a direct political consequence in the methods of governance and so on. So he was apparently, at least, extremely tolerant in religious matters. And as always, this has nothing to do with the modern concept of tolerance that did not exist before, Western Europe in the second half of the 17th century. Just like his own people, Genghiz Khan had a more a magical than properly religious vision of the world, the various cults, and he was just searching, let's say, within the cultures that he came to meet with, that were depositors of such knowledge and such beliefs, etc. Some forces, let's say, that would have had time after time, favored him in a way or not. It was a very pragmatic approach, and this explains why at his court, aside from Taoist sages, like, there were also Christian priests, and there were and liturgies. A bit of all the religious cults were recited. And so you understand that even the background of such beliefs such attitudes were based in a very different way from the one we realize. Let's say, I will see it better towards the end, but my idea about the Mongol Empire in general is, of great interest and say great relevance, but at the same time represents an exception in the great world empires, right? Were mostly sedentary, right? And this one was something else that lasted also, in a particular amount of time. It had this important dynamics with a world that technically had taken over the world, like Mongolia, that, however, remained Mongolia. Whereas you can argue that the Mongol influences kind of lived beyond that, more as a cultural legacy rather than, a direct expression of a Mongol rule over those regions that went on as other countries. So this is particularly important in a broader perspective. It is proper also of other empires. As we were saying before, also the Caliphate essentially embodies this, and it's also the lack of a unifying doctrine, or something that could live on as a unitary religion that is quite meaningful in this regard. That was mostly a process of acculturation of the Mongols that also still, however, again remained the Mongols. Whereas, yes, there were these problems of managing other countries, etc., that express Mongol tolerance in the obvious realization that they could have not kept them just throughout sheer threat of annihilation, but truly, accepting giving autonomy to those who they had controlled. And so the nature of political dominations is always very negotiable in nature. And in any case, here we have to explain also part of the military dimension of the empire, and especially Genghiz Khan. The stories on Vum are surely loaded with praise of capacity, etc., but also in a logical, rational sense. We don't know much about. We can't scientifically measure like who this man was concretely, and also much of these campaigns, etc. Albeit they did happen, right? We mostly read them from stories that are very different from what you're normally habituated, looking even at just the contemporary Western historiography, right? It's a completely different world, a completely different mindset, and definitely not a particularly rationally or scientifically oriented one when it came to properly assess, the dimension of certain military accomplishments, or properly how they managed to do it. Surely they happened, so we can surely stress that Genghiz Khan was one of the greatest leaders in the history of mankind, and there's no doubt. But yet, I wouldn't say we stop there, but almost in general. Like, if you can't assess things, with a certain degree of precision, it's also difficult to even express some judgment in the first place. As we were saying before, what the Mongol military qualities would substantiate itself into was not much the tactics that we see employed, even with striking success. Think about the Battle of Moy or Lenitsa, etc., where the Westerners were appallingly defeated, right, embarrassingly defeated that easily. But we very often we also kind of overestimate it's very easy to make a rhetoric of the lost cause, right? To say that the Mongols were unstoppable, that they were the strongest, that they had the best system, so there was no match. This means actually devaluating the Mongol military system, because modern historiography has at this point realized that the Mongol armies that were often described at the time, especially from those sides of those, in fact, literate cultures that were, seeing literally their countries taken over by these nomadic warriors come literally from nowhere, that nobody knew what the hell was going on, were stressed out. Were huge hordes of so many, these huge armies that overwhelmed everything just because. But factually, we see that very often Mongol armies were even smaller in number than one of their enemies, and that this speaks actually in terms of success of the quality of this system. And so it's not much of a tactic that we say, you see, I know, because the Mongols had the tactic that opened, the center, they let the enemies in, and they refused even the center, and then they eventually counterattacked, and they enclosed them with the wings that had departed. And so, that's the genius to think. Those were tactics that were employed basically by all steppes peoples that Westerners had always coped with, and that are also quite, they are not absolutely like in any tactics that they have nothing to do with the actual degree of success, right? You can carry out those tactics and losing miserably, and it's also actually the fact that you enact those tactics in part speaks also for some aspects of weaknesses, right, as to other levels of strength, etc., that all military systems have, and that in that case is the fact that there is still a light cavalry component in the field that cannot quite withstand the impact of heavy cavalry, and therefore has to play on its mobility and speed, and to coordinate this tactic that is complex, but that these peoples were normally trained to do, and that there were surely the Mongols brought in the steppes warfare something more articulate than had been seen before. Normally, other Turkic people had somewhat simpler types of simpler tactics, sometimes just a single line and not much of a greater tactical sophistication. But even that system was functional to it, to in a certain sense. It's not better or worse. It depends on the situations. The Mongols were what really made the Mongol capacity was their level of collective training. That is something that you can achieve only through experience, through political cohesion, and that's what makes factually the quality of it all, right? It's the moral force that this system was able to invest in military matters, how experienced these troops and how determined they were, and how motivated they were by what they were motivated, right? So if you don't have that, you can have all the tactical systems that you want, but you may not be able to enact them, not even bring an army from the other side of the globe, just because you decide you want to take over the globe, right? That has nothing to do with the technical aspect of it. It has to do with how motivated you are, because if you're not motivated, you remain there sitting in Mongolia and nothing else, right? Instead, these people were evidently motivated by something great that was the greatest, one of the greatest moral elevations in the history of mankind, with a clear vision of systematic subjugation of the entire world by divine call, right? As a divine stock, and as a as a broader. We don't even know all the prophecies, all the visions, all the feelings that these people partook, right? They collectively, and so. That is what made the Mongols the Mongols. The system developed along the way. Surely, Mongol armies were something much more rudimentary at the time, Genghiz Khan was moving his first steps, rather than, how they were at the time of his death, because, the function develops the organ, and so that's how the Mongol army came to be. There could have not been a Mongol army of that degree of effectiveness if there hadn't been that aforementioned Mongol national cohesion, right? And so also the resources to invest into that would fuel the system forward and also change it over time. The Mongols brought with them also the important capacities that they had learned from fighting, for example, against the Chinese. They were quite effective in sieges, for example, and in Mongolia there were no cities. They were quite effective in artillery, the first explosive devices, things of that they weren't surely kind of a Mongol thing by default. They had mostly learned from China. They would keep learning and integrating, and many other aspects. And also, think about all the subjugated populations that they moved alongside them, that they trained to to operate on the field to support their own traditional cavalry. We made videos about some. I created a medieval Mongolia playlist that includes also some kind of later systems, just the Timurid one, and that shows how, of course, there was a gradual, as we were saying before, dilution of the during the centuries of the traditional Mongol warfare in favor of the local military traditions, forms of organization. But it's kind of obvious, right? And so what you would be amazed by, even just, it was speaking of moral forces of a Mongol army, is this formidable armies of tens of thousands of horse archers attacking in the most complete silence, guided by signals such as flags of different colors. These great drums that gave them all in a perfectly aligned way, because they all knew what to do at that point. And so these maneuvers in absolute and terrifying symmetry that were reflecting the celestial perfection and their absolute and fanatic loyalty to the universal ruler, to the oceanic ruler that was an embodiment itself of the military deity of the skies. And surely there was a lot of organization behind this, a lot of logistical capacities that is also, but the less glorious visually aspect of the thing. But the Mongols were dramatic organizers, and this of course was also due to the capacities of the individual leaders. And Genghiz Khan's face was important in front of the subjected peoples, because with ferocious exterminations, right, massacres, he would rationally create an image of invincibility and inflexibility. Right, it was something that this leader knew better in virtue of his divine status, and so you couldn't already by default, not avoid to fear him, right? And so it was arguably even more of a challenge for him to live up to that standard, rather than just trying to convince anybody at some point that he was the one he was. And so his victories were kind of the proof of that. And that's a legacy you have to live up to also for your descendants and so on. And so even the great massacres that we see in the Khwarezmian Empire and so on were very coldly calculated to strike terror to the enemy and to in the international arena, right, to see, look at what we are able to do. Because this is going to happen to you in the same way, if you even think you can withstand us. And so not everybody, of course, was, there were some universal values there that were pretty much the same, that is saying nuts, right? The same reason why the Khwarezmians made the end they did. Also, that's why the Russians made the end they did. So you can't quite tell somebody to just plain surrender without a fight. And surely this system, however, was new, was at least in its projection capabilities and impacting forces, something really unforeseen, given the average scale of operations which the Eurasian powers were habituated to. And surely when the Mongols couldn't, reach, what they couldn't reach with arms, they would reach with politics. Their enemies knew that submitting to Genghiz Khan meant to find in him a magnanimous lord, after all, a powerful and generous protector, while resisting, in fact, equated to extermination. So after having unified the Mongol peoples in 1211, Genghiz Khan started his campaign for the conquest of China. Meanwhile, between 1219 and 1220, the Mongols subjugated the Iranic Persian kingdom of the Khwarezmians between the Baikal and eastern Iran. The Mongols took Bukhara and Samarkand, were, as you know, very, very important trade centers, cultural centers too, on the Silk Road, and some important Islamic centers. And after this, he led north towards the Russian steppes, destroying the so-called Great Bulgaria, the Volga Bulgars, deportating their population. And when Genghiz Khan died in 1227, his empire stretched from Siberia to Kashmir, Tibet, from the Caspian Sea to the Sea of Japan. And he had committed immense massacres and great deportations of entire masses. He had founded and destroyed cities at the root, at the foundation. But he had edified a solid Pacific, or better, pacified empire, where in fact the Pax Mongolica was as inflexible but kind of fair, right? It allowed people of different language, stock, or religion to coexist, right? And what is the legacy of let's say, of Genghiz Khan, or this first wave of conquest, let's say, and already, considering also what was present at the core in the next ones, accordingly. Well, it's complex to judge in this sense. I mean, we should always contextualize in the realities of the time, which is the greatest challenge for everybody in this sense. As to exterminations, people say that, consider world population at the time was something like not even 400 million people. So some have tried to give, like, how many people did Genghiz Khan kill? And some estimates, especially of civilians, arrive from, we're talking in the range between millions and tens of millions, over something like 380 million people in the world, right? The Mongol Empire was also considered the largest contiguous empire historically existing from an extensional point of view. And so this naturally is important because it has to make us reflect, as we were saying before, on the territorial nature of this domination. What did it mean to launch these expeditions and to kind of create this empire, right? What was the actual consistency of this empire? Was there a solid empire that existed with some boundaries extended at this? No, right? It was obviously based on the projection capacity of the Mongols, on their deterrence, of their political cohesion. So it's no surprise that it kind of fragmented later on, because there was no other implicit reason for which it should last, right? You could not unify administratively, like with a proper direct control, all this war. It was impossible. It was beyond the reach of any realistic possibility at the time. It was about installing itself in some important centers of power, ruling from there, and still maintaining this important cultural, say, cohesion behind the idea of course, the idea of the celestial, of the divine power, of this almost, in fact, dynastic racial, connection with the Genghiz house and its descendants that were to rule as, this divine possession and so on. So it was kind of made sense. It was a way of, as we've seen, that many peoples had kind of tried to cope with the lack of further centralistic capacities and so on. The massacres are kind of, sometimes are really unspeakable, because it wasn't just about massacring, it was also about deporting, enslaving en masse. Some scholars have suggested that the first real genocide in history have actually happened in Mongol times, because they literally wiped out some peoples from the face of the earth, right? And that the term genocide is quite controversial, because it kind of acquired this meaning of improperly of just a genocide is killing a lot of people. Really, no, right? Genocide is not an insultive term that you use to say, that's an evil guy because he killed people, right? How many people? Many, so it's genocide. It makes the difference. It really depends. You can kill millions of people just with an economical policy. Nobody will think it's a genocide. Others, if you are in a military situation, you may be forced actually to kill, or to indirectly cause the death or starvation of so many people. And then at that point, you also have to realize that war is made in two. And so how does that happen? Is it just, a vicious personal targeting of some people because of their politics or ethnicity or religion or whatever? And it's very difficult to distinguish that, given that war is just, in fact, a continuation of policy with other means. And so, what is a political reason for killing people? Every reason is political. Even, drinking a glass of water is political, fundamentally, if you think about it, in its consequences or whatever they can be. So it's a very vague, sometimes hypocritical terms. Surely the Mongols weren't a people endowed with particular, sensitivity and care and, great, great consideration for human life, if you wondered that, or anything that resembled kind of our, human rights in a sense. But as we've seen, as all humans, they were endowed with the capacity to, to regulate a community, to allow different cults to coexist, to realize the benefits deriving from civilization. This is yet another thing. These were fundamentally barbarians that had understood, by secular contact with at the outskirts of the great civilizations, that there were opportunities in power and in a broader universal sense to dominate the world, and to do it in a kind of a fair sense that could make all these peoples participating to a sort of greater thing. And so cooptation was obvious. As dreadfully terroristic, sanguinary and ruthless the Mongol conquests could be, Genghiz Khan would often make the survivors rise sometimes to the rank of their own family, especially obviously in the Mongol environment. Even if they had been defeated, that was a political move to keep fueling the expansion. We see it in many other circumstances, that the same how the Romans made it, extending their citizenship, but still maintaining this sacral idea of pure action in a military religious sense. It was still based on radical systematic subjugation of basically whoever they met, right? And and still offering, however, the compromise between joining in and partaking to that kind of system, or total annihilation. So that distinction is quite important in a civilizational sense, because it offers you space either for a constructive, a cooperation, or even if in the struggle, at least to prove that you are capable civilizationally to oppose such great moral force that is evidently the only recipe for creating a real civilization. And if not, you doomed yourself at that point. So we definitely can't judge the Mongol accomplishments on the grounds of our own standards. Sure is that, as we were saying before, the problem with the Mongols is not much a matter of how many people they killed, frankly, but let's say, first of all, what they did for, and did it for, and secondly, and which is surely lost in in comprehension, at least in, again, for our moral standards, even though we actually know in a broader anthropological sense, in a political and social and religious and military sense, why they did it, and it's perfectly logical and coherent. It's just that, again, we're talking about a system that doesn't matter how much legacy maintained, right, spread in the world, still wasn't able to properly replicate itself. Was this massive wave of conquests that surely molded most of, as we've seen, of Eurasia in the way it did, but still that at a certain point disconnected itself from the spring, right? From Mongolia itself, that stayed there fundamentally, and this empire still fragmented by the 14th century into powers that fundamentally didn't have much in common in the first place, and kept living mostly as the legacy of the pre-Mongol era rather than the Mongol one. So we can't reduce the oceanic legacy to nothing, right? This, even if you consider the Ottomans, for example, that were becoming a regional power between the 15th and the 16th century, and they would subjugate the Khanate of Crimea that descended from the Tartar waves, and so they also cooperated with the Golden Horde and so on. And in spite of their power, they recognized in a reverential way, the greatness that lived in the Khanate, imperial ideology as a Genghiz legacy, right? So the Ottomans, so the Turks. This is interesting because even if you consider, for example, Timur-Lenk Empire, right? That at that point, being a Mongol was mostly like certificate of that kind of moral prowess and military capacity that had made the people kind of ethnically the standard there. So Timur-Lenk, as far as we know, he was more like probably a Turk. He may have been probably even an Indo-European. We don't know because we're all mixed, especially in those areas where he emerged from. But he would mostly take on his Mongol legacy because why? Because of the Mongol Empire that had happened. It had been something so clamorously absolute and unreachable and inexplainable, if not in an absolutely religious and military sense, that there was no other option but picking that model. And so in this regard, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, it's difficult, especially for a Westerner, to understand how much that meant. It's difficult because we don't usually know how a Chinese normally reasons, or how even the Mongol influence in India later on, right? India that had escaped fundamentally Mongol conquest, but still ended up in theory to be taken over by a relic of that. And even a Persian mentality is regarding to these things. It's not easy to properly understand. If we're not talking about all these sometimes still nomadic peoples existing in countries that eventually were taken over by the Russians, that so lived through this ethnic repression and reduction, and eventually through communism, through and that still somewhat share, however, maybe are the closest that we can find to what could be a nomadic mentality of the time of Genghiz Khan and so on. The same Mongolia, believed different feelings about this because of mostly of the socialist era that looked at a power like that one as a kind of a reactionary, evil, ancien regime, one that was against the socialistic progress and all this. So it's not that the Mongols do not, the modern Mongols do not regard Genghiz Khan as their national father and hero and so on. Of course, they would, but still, what I mean is that the cultural lenses that we have to understand the Mongol legacy are very often, first of all, distorted properly from a scientific point of view, because in all these countries, like you don't really have a real scientific standard to the one we reach in the West. So it's very difficult even to find any historiography that is not still polluted by some political ideologies that have basically nothing to do with history, but just with the issues of of history that came later, and also that are frankly different culturally from us in the first place, so that it's very difficult to reach that. In Europe, again, what we had mostly was something that you can recognize in Russia, right? There is much in post Mongol Russia, post 13th century Russia that informed the local political and social culture mindset, that you would be amazed how much it owes actually to an Asiatic, oceanic overlord than a Western, kind of modern mentality. And I presume there is no doubt that that the rise of the Muscovy as the most loyal servant of the Golden Horde, that eventually became, was the one that managed to shake off the Tartar yoke from kind of acquiring and eventually taking over the same Mongol world, the same Siberia and so on throughout the centuries, was, as by the way, Moscow, that was one of the weakest, most peripheral, most insignificant centers in Russia historically. Think about think about Kiev, think about Novgorod, think about the same Vladimir, from which Moscow drew the eventually what had been the Orthodox legacy from and the Byzantine one from the Patriarchy of Kiev that had shifted there, eventually brought to Moscow itself, was a radically autocratic, privatistic, militaristic, and in imperialistic creation that owed dramatically to the Tartar moral government, right? And Russia was overrun by this system. It was not just a Muscovite thing, right? After the Mongol invasions, Russia had become fundamentally a vassal state of the Mongols, and you can easily see it in their political, military, and social organization and archaeology, right? There is probably a radical shift that had made, before the Mongol times, Russia kind of more similar to at least there were still differences already outlineable at the time. It was something, say, more similar to Central Europe, roughly, to make you understand what I'm talking about, than it would become later on, for which today we can really draw a very evident line between what we call Central Europe, and also including the Western Slavic world and so on, and the Eastern Europe strictly meant. And this does have a lot to do with that, and probably without that Mongol influence, we wouldn't even know a modern Russia, right? A unified one, at least, right? Something that could, after all, withstand the all the Polish-Lithuanian incursions, also this, initially the Tartar pressure, and that could keep together such a huge disconnected reality like the Russian one was at the time, as also the Kievan Rus represents, with principalities that, yes, were even there theoretically all, dynastically connected, but they were wildly different in nature from the, if you look at the extremes, or also the peoples they border with and so on. So maybe there we can find what that really means, right? If you're really impressed, if you're really interested in understanding, if you want the divide that stands between the West in a way and really what we can see from within the same West of the legacy, a bit of what the Asian, what the Mongol world, the Oceanic world really was. You can't. I suppose in Russian mindset, aside from all the the further degenerative, and still sadly irreversible damage that caused by socialism and all these things, and that brings such appallingly political and social costs to Russia and to the rest of the world to this day. You can still find it in a way. I mean, it's this utter primitive brutality, right, in the political essence of that culture. It's something appalling. And of course, Russia in some ways was something different from that, especially in the elites, right? But those, because they had been westernized, because since Peter the Great, and there had been an effort to modernization and so on, but still under Catherine the Great, efforts for liberalization. But if you wonder why those failed, and even things like the Russian Revolution, which especially the Bolshevik one, the second one, was not deterministically to happen forcefully, right? But in a sense, it's also because of that. It's also because of the same nature of Russian autocracy, without which that country couldn't quite stand together, because it would lack the means of doing it. This is something, in fact, that you see even in Russian deficit of democracy. It's fundamentally due to that. It's functional to still keeping the system together. Maybe, yes, there are other, tracing it to the Mongol influence in Russia is maybe, it's surely not it's not a decisive factor, but believe me, that did contribute. That did, let's say, expose the world to kind of this hybrid that we can see still in this aspect. Because for the rest, I wouldn't know where to find it. I mean, the Chinese completely erased any kind of historical identity from themselves. Any kind. Any possible measure of, this damages of communism, of course. So you can't really understand there. The Mongols, too, I don't really presume that there is much you can, in terms of educational system or research or whatever, that actually still makes you survive a decent grasp of what, in a deeper philosophical, scientific sense, and based on cultural legacy or sense of identity, can make you closer to the idea of what the Mongols were by the time of Genghiz Khan. So I guess in a way we have still to rely on our external means to kind of sort the thing out. I personally, I must tell you, is that I didn't really ever study or get interested in the Mongols myself, even though I surely recognize the importance and the greatness of the topic, etc., as a military historian and medievalist and so on. But I never got into it, and I still have to sort a lot of things out, because again, you're not born taught in these things, and still the evidence it's dramatically scarce, and simply the tools and the methods therefore have to be readapted with a certain margin of approximation, and this has, in my opinion, a great is more important than answering the question itself, because acknowledging that is still, in my opinion, starting from the right premises. Excuse me, I drink a little. And we will keep talking about the Mongols. We'll talk about the invasion of Europe, all these things, because those are also very interesting topics. You could argue what did the, aside from Eastern Europe, where did the Mongols? Well, the Mongols basically arrived at the gates of Germany. Certain parties crossed the Alps into Italy. The Mongols invaded as far as Serbia following the Danubian. So they invaded Poland 3 times. So they crushed the Hungarian army. There are some, the magnitude is heavy. The Genoese colony in Kaffa was destroyed. There were some, like, Europeans had eyes to see, right, and they were surely involved in much of the, in stemming the main outstretching that enormous tide that had overrun Russia, as we've seen, had overrun many other countries. I mean, by the mid 13th century, we have seen what this impact had for the Islamic world. After all, the Europeans kind of knew. We were still in contact with the Arabs, with the Turkish world, so they kind of knew and they kind of saw. And you can argue that the Mongol Tartar influence, we've seen it, was present very, very closely. In the series we make about the 1683 siege of Vienna, we know that if you had gone out Vienna, the surroundings, there were Tartars swarming around, because of course the Ottomans brought them from not just from Crimea, but who knows where they also came from, because that was kind of typical of their culture. I mean, as soon as there was to raid, it was simply joined from everywhere, right? And so there is something wild in this archetypal models that we narrative. In fact, from that steppe dimension that we blurred a bit all in, like the Indo-Europeans, the Turks, the Ugrofinns, the Mongols, right? Think about the Polish Szlachta, that they had to say that they were kind of Sarmatic in nature, and that they were kind of very, you see, the principle of autocracy that I was talking to you about relatively to Eastern Europe was very convenient for the elites, right? As we were saying before, in Russia, what happened is that the middle classes of the great trade centers of the great Russian rivers and cities of the Rus were wiped out for an autocratic seigneury to rise and to create, the serfs that remained up to the 19th century. I mean, so this, in a sense, the Mongols as a cultural model, at least the steppe as a cultural model, was seen as this fierce, horrifying, terrifying thing that sometimes could even serve the purpose of a more autocratic regime. I mean, there are. I mean, think about the Germans themselves. The same, William II, that would claim that the Germans themselves were kind of ferocious like the Huns, because the Germans, even implicitly as Central Europe, and therefore unmeasurably open to the actual East and even further away the steppe, would feel to have received that model in a way. I mean, the migration era Draconis standards are witnessed in Germany up to the 13th century. That's how Central Europe as a hybrid thing between Western and Eastern Europe kind of is embodied, like in countries that we give for granted, like mostly as a like a Cold War legacy, as Western in nature, but factually are really not that much, right? And so sometimes it's cultural. It is cultural. It is the need of feeling yourself like more sympathetically connected to the conqueror of the steppe than this. Think about, even in Hungarian nationalism, the idea that those are very debated things, but there are certain groups in the complication that prefer to stress the idea of not being prevalently kind of European peoples, but something more fiercely steppe kind of dominator. Think about the tyrannic propaganda and all those things, because they prefer to say we're not Slavs, we're not Germans, so we are the super special guys and not this neighbors that the gods of whom we hate, right? And that's interesting because the Hungarians are maybe, yes, they do speak an Ugro-Finnic language, but they're also very similar to the Slavs in some ways. And so I'm sure that there's somebody who wants to kill me now, but because of what I just said. But history is also not really an option. Unfortunately, however, again, the eastern you go, the more difficult it becomes to even trace history, because literally they produced less. There were realities that wrote less. There were less populated areas, less economically developed areas. So we also lost a lot of that thing. And surely the Mongols contributed, especially in certain realities, to raise everything to the ground. And so somebody saying the Mongols also initially were a bit more brutal in nature. They would just raise things to the ground by default, which is a bit also an exaggeration, and eventually it would kind of civilize and become more treatable. But it's also a simplistic thing, but rather it does show the, however, as a trend, what happens where, the magnitude of an empire kind of decreases eventually in power and so on. So these are all different reflections we can make regarding the Mongols, their legacy, identity, and all these things. And it would be interesting to have also a bit more of an international dialogue about these things, because it seems that every time we talk about global history, it's mostly about realizing that we were all connected, that it was all multicultural, that it was but at the end of the day, there are also some, areas that remain excluded from this, and something so big like the Mongol Empire seemed to me that it speaks to certain chords that, especially to Europeans, are quite striking, because that steppe dimension is much more at the root of European identity than it seems. Since the Indo-European origins and so on. So that would be paradoxically maybe less meaningful to an Indian, maybe, even though they had the Mongols, or to a same Arab in a way, or surely to an African. Despite, yes, there were some things, attacking the Ayyubids, the Mamluks and so on, but it's a matter of perspectives, and getting perspectives is sometimes even of some degree of consistency and objectivity. It's very rare, right? And however, my take on the Mongols is that definitely we should be assess their achievements, of course, in a contextual way, like in any historical thing, but in this sense, realizing also the limits of their culture, I believe, because again, this was not an empire that remained, right? We don't account the Mongol Empire as a great power strictly meant historically that continued at some point. It was like this enormous wave of conquest and then a fragmentation, and then basically you don't hear of Mongolia anymore historically. So that's eloquent regarding to those, that narrative that I tried to give at the beginning about the millenary alternation of waves of peoples from the steppes, of which the Mongols seem to have been the last, in a way exactly because they were the most primitive of all, right? Or at least in that, in parallel to the stage of development of civilization in the rest of the world, in a sense they were. And they were the last in that, as we've seen, west-east axis that we traced before. All right. For today, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.